Hi all, welcome to the next instalment of Anatomy Physiology lectures. This one is the nervous system. For the purposes of this lecture, things that will help you out leading towards the assessment will be the Prezi, which you see here. You'll also need a picture here that can be downloaded off Moodle or in your class notes booklet. You'll find a front and back view of a human body outline. Okay, and the third thing that would be useful to have nearby is the mock questions for the test, section 1, nervous system. And this essentially is the testable information that we draw out of the Prezi that will be included in the assessment. So at the end of this lecture process, you can study up these questions and you'll be well prepared come test time. So on we go. So the nervous system. Just giving a quick overview of the basic premise of the nervous system and how it works before we dive into it in a bit more detail. We're obviously talking about here the body's main control system. You can see it in the picture that we're looking at here. The brain acts as the supercomputer that receives millions of messages from your body's sensory organs, letting it know what's going on in and around the body. It assimilates all of that information and decides sometimes to act on it. And when it acts on it, it will send out instructions to the body parts to cause actions around the body that will help keep A, the body safe, and B, the body functioning the way it's supposed to. The main functions of the nervous system can be summarized in these 4 points here, and these are the 4 points that we'll need to transfer shortly over to our mock question sheet. So functions of the nervous system include controlling our internal environment, spinal cord reflexes, memory and learning, and movement. So let's have a look at each of them in a little bit more detail. So control of the internal environment is really where, through the processes I just described, receptors from within the body keep the brain constantly updated with what's going on inside the body, and that can be things such as temperature and heart rate and oxygen delivery and the levels of glucose within the blood and where your blood's going and where it's needed and all those kind of things. So the sensory receptors keep the brain constantly updated with the current state of play. The term that we use to talk about body balance and the way in which the body would like to exist is called homeostasis, and that's having a desirable set temperature, desirable resting blood pressure, heart rate, etc., and good levels of the nutrients that we need floating around the bloodstream. So the brain will constantly evaluate the information coming in, and then if it feels that we've been taken outside of our homeostasis, for example, oxygen levels are beginning to drop, fuel levels, etc., then it will cause a series of motor responses that will get the body to make changes to bring it back into homeostasis. And those could include increasing heart rate and breathing to get more oxygen around the body. It could be causing the liver to release glucose out into the bloodstream, or even making you hungry, tired, or anything else to get you to do what it needs you to do, whether that be sleep, eat, or other. Second of the functions is spinal cord reflexes. These are our primary reflexes that are designed to keep us alive and safe. Most of these are developed in the womb, and others are developed through our life experiences. So examples of that would be things that are developed within the womb include our blinking response to stop stuff going in our eyes and keep our eyes moist, the gag reflex to stop stuff entering our throat and choking us, and pain reflexes would be in there as well. So if we have painful stimuli at the skin or other places, that we react appropriately to that by removing ourselves quickly from the pain-giving source. And then you've got the others that are developed through life experience, and that could be through painful stimuli again, maybe a bee sting or something that lets you know that when an insect is buzzing around your head in the future, that you should probably attempt to get yourself out of that situation. And also I guess, some of our fight or flight reflexes, where it determines how we behave when a ball is flying at our face, when a punch is thrown towards us, and those kind of things. So obviously when you start out, you may not have developed and honed those reflexes, so you might be a bit slow when a ball flies at your face until the first time that it makes connection. And then you learn pretty quickly after that when something is flying at your face, that you dodge and get yourself out of the way. Obviously these reflexes are necessary for our protection, and we need them for times where there isn't enough time for our higher brain or conscious brain to get involved in the response. We need a response to happen so that we can limit the amount of damage or avoid damage altogether. Memory and learning is a vital part of the nervous system. Not everything that comes into our brain is acted upon immediately. In many cases, lots of this information is stored for a later time and then built on, and that forms our experiences and memory, and it ensures that we don't have to start from scratch every time we learn something new. We can assimilate information, compare it to information we've known and stored before, and remember entire processes sometimes that will help us to pick up new skills. So a great example of that would be learning to throw a ball. And once you've learned to throw a ball and grooved it, if you were then introduced to something like tennis and an overhead serve or overhead shot, then a lot of the same mechanics involved in that shot are involved in your throw, and so your coordination and putting together of the stroke of a tennis serve would happen a lot quicker from previous experience of throwing. So the brain has obviously an amazing ability to store heaps of facts. Many of these you probably don't want in there, but they stick around, and then others, like the information for this test, that you have to fight really hard to get to stick in your brain for even a short amount of time. The final function we'll make note of is movement. No movement occurs in the human body really without input from the central nervous system. So it may be an involuntary movement such as a reflex or the pushing of food or fluid through your bloodstream or through your digestive system, or it could be conscious and deliberate voluntary actions that we decide to do, like picking up a weight and doing curls, or throwing and catching a ball. So those are the four key functions of the nervous system, and what we'll do is we'll just pause at this juncture for a second, open up our exam mock questions here, and you'll see a space, functions of the nervous system, and we'll write in our 4 function titles there, which of course were learning and memory, movement, the control of the internal environment, and spinal cord reflexes. So feel free to pause the video and fill out those 4 from the present now. So the next slide here shows an overview of the nervous system, and this is a good way to get to know the nervous system using a flowchart system here. What it shows is right at the top here are 2 key and primary nervous system divisions. The top one that you see, the central nervous system, includes your brain and your spinal cord, and that's really the area of the nervous system, or the part of the nervous system that makes decisions and also houses our reflexes. So it's where all information is effectively relayed to cause action. Now, of course, it needs both input and output, so plugs coming in and plugs coming out, and those plugs would be known as neurons or nerves, and we have some coming in from the sensory division here, and generally they're represented as going up, because most sensory information is coming from the body up to the brain, and therefore would travel up, and the sensory division would be bringing in information like levels of gases and nutrients within the body. It would bring in information like pain and pleasure and smell and taste and all of those things that help us experience the world, and it would travel up through spinal nerves, so firstly through sensory nerves entering the spinal cord and then raising up towards the brain there. You do also have some nerves that plug directly into the brain, and those are typically found above the level of the neck, where there would be no point in joining into the spinal cord because you're already above it. So muscles of the face, sensors of the ears and from the nose and mouth, etc., will go and plug directly into the brain. Of course, once the brain or spinal cord has either made its decision or sent its reflex, that'll get carried out through motor neurons through the motor division, and then it's just a question of whether it was a voluntary decision that was passed down or whether it was an involuntary decision such as a reflex or an internal housekeeping matter, and that would then get passed on down to the doers of the body, such as your muscles, organs and glands, and cause action to occur. The last of the divisions we see here that we'll talk about much later on are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and these are both autonomic or involuntary nervous system pathways for action. Sympathetics, better known as the fight or flight system, so that's your pre-programmed response to things like painful stimuli, being scared or fearful, those kind of things. So most people are either predetermined really to fight, to run away, or just freeze in those kind of situations where danger has presented itself. And then the parasympathetic side of things is where your body's housekeeping sort of happens. So that's your breathing and heart rate regulation, digestion and all those kind of processes. So nice little overview and a nice way of remembering some of the key questions that will be asked when it comes to assessment time. And we might as well look at a couple of those questions now that we've got some idea of the orientation of the nervous system there. So just a reminder, we've got our main two divisions, the central and peripheral nervous system, where the central nervous system includes the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is the nerves that are running out to and from the body parts. So we'll dive back into our mock questions at this point. And we'll skip to question 3, leaving out question 2 for the moment. The nervous system is divided into two major divisions. What are they? It's the central nervous system, called the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, called the PNS. And then what are the two divisions of the PNS? That's the two main divisions of the nerves coming in and out of the nervous system. And the messages coming in are part of the sensory division, and the messages that are sent out of the CNS are known as the motor division. So sensory and motor. And that information is going to link quite nicely to the next thing we look at, which we start to look at these lines of communication and how messages are passed around the body. So the three main components of the nervous system, if we were to pull out someone's nervous system and have it dangling from our hand, we would be holding on to the brain. It would have the spinal cord dangling from it, and then it would have this network of nerves and neurons that would attach into the spinal cord along the way and head out to the different body parts. So we'll dive in and look at each of these things in a little bit more detail. So the brain, obviously along with the spinal cord, is the central nervous system, and it's the supercomputer of this whole system. We're looking at a cross-section of a brain here, so it's been cut from the front of the head here through to the back of the head here, and we're looking at it from a central cut that's been made right through probably the centre of your skull all the way down, and we're looking at the brain from side on, so we can see the inner portion here as well. First thing we note is probably the more recognisable part of the brain that we've seen in movies and zombie films and that's this sort of dimpled outer layer here. And this dimpled outer layer is called the cerebrum, and its function really is to make living more enjoyable. Probably the easiest way to put it. It's not vital to life at its most basic. It's not really responsible for anything like breathing or keeping your blood flow going or your heart rate and those kind of things. This one's more about experiencing the world that you're in. So it's broken into lobes, and a lot of people are familiar with the different lobes, particularly this one here labelled the frontal lobe. So that's coming from about this portion here up to the central sulcus there and all around the front part of the brain here. And the front part of your brain is where your conscious brain lives. That's where, if you're thinking consciously, if you're arguing or debating something with yourself, that's where you're doing it. This is your conscious self. This is the house and seat of your personality. These are where your thoughts and all of your inner thinking goes on, that you're consciously aware of. It also houses your motor control center. So this is where messages to fire your muscles and make you move around voluntarily would come from. Your speech center is located in the frontal lobe as well. And what we'll find is that as we go through and identify the things that are housed in the different lobes, obviously injuring those parts of the brain would cause deficits in the types of things we're talking about. So in the case of a frontal lobe impact, we would therefore have problems with coordinating muscle movement, making our muscles do the things we want them to do. We'd have problems with speech, slurred speech, etc. We'd also have problems with creating a conscious stream of thoughts and making sense. In the old days, that was the way they dealt with the hardened criminals within the justice system, was to give them a frontal lobotomy, which took away their ability to think effectively, move, and speak. So these people would sit there effectively brain dead and just vegetate to some degree. The sort of central to rear portion of the brain here is known as the parietal lobe or parietal lobe. This is your sensory section of the brain where all sensory information effectively arrives to and it makes sense of. So this is where pain and pleasure and pressure and touch and a raft of other sensory information, often coming from places like the skin and your soft tissue, would end up in this place here, and it would make sense of the information that's coming in. It would then communicate with the frontal lobe to then make a decision on what needs to be done in response to the feelings it's getting, and then send the information out. So an example of that could be the pleasure centers sort of lighting up when you eat something you really enjoy, and then conversing along with the frontal lobe, and your frontal lobe agreeing and saying, yeah, that's really good, I really enjoyed that, I think I'll eat some more, and picking up some more food and having another bite. So the parietal lobe. Then we have this back lobe here called the occipital lobe, placed about as far as you can get in the brain from the sensory receptors that it basically culminates the process of the information from, and that is the eyes. So the eyes would be sitting over here, and they come via the optic nerve all the way to the occipital lobe, where it makes sense of the pictures and colours and things that come into our eyes. So this is our vision centre, where our primary visual cortex resides. The fourth lobe of the brain isn't possible to be seen in this picture. It's the temporal lobe and sits over the ear, effectively, so just above the ear, and it's responsible for auditory information, has a role in balance, and also association, which is your ability to remember and recognise things like people's faces and that kind of thing. We'll talk more through that soon. So the only other things of note in here that we see this sort of cauliflower or broccoli looking part of the brain here called the cerebellum. That is your coordination center, so it's heavily involved in coordinating movement and also storing motor programs so that we can access them and remember how to do things like run, jump, throw, and use that information to assist the frontal lobe in the decisions it makes in terms of firing your legs, arms, and torso muscles. So a great example of the cerebellum at work would be if you were sitting cross-legged on the floor and you wanted to stand up. Now, you would take a moment of preparation before you did that, and that moment of preparation would be where the conscious brain converses with the cerebellum, finds out the best way to get up from the position you're currently in, and then the execution to move would come from the frontal lobe, shoot down the spinal cord and go to those muscles in a sequenced and coordinated sort of fashion. So as we learn and refine our movements, those motor programs will be stored here in the cerebellum. And the cerebellum's key role is determining where your body parts are in space at any time, and then the best form of movement that will achieve the goal of the movement that you have set. So cats have a very developed cerebellum. We all know that if you throw a cat, it tends to land on its feet. So it's got very good spatial awareness of where it is and where its body parts are in space when it's put through the unfortunate situation of being tossed in the air. Not that I'm suggesting you go and start doing that. Just take my word for it. The last part of the brain that we see here is the brain stem and the midbrain that we call this part here, which houses these inner sort of folds that you see here. Now these are more critical than the things around the outside. Like I said, the things around the outside here, these lobes, they make life more enjoyable. You experience things, you can make decisions and actions that you want to make, and you can experience the world through vision as well. These parts are more vital for your survival in terms of your temperature control, your breathing, your heart rate, your blood distribution and gas delivery around the body. So the two key players in this, the thalamus and hypothalamus in particular, are parts of the brain that we'll discuss at some length as we get into the autonomic nervous system. So they receive all of the information that comes through, and the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that acts on a lot of that information and sends out messages to different organs of the body to keep them doing what they're supposed to do to maintain the body as it goes through its life cycle. Might have seen the medulla oblongata or heard of it before on Waterboy. He had apparently damaged his medulla oblongata, and that would cause him a lot more issues than just being a bit slow like the Waterboy movies suggest. This guy here is a sort of intermediary between the key organs of the body and the hypothalamus, who makes the decisions about what those organs should do. And it acts as a kind of auto-regulator or auto-conductor, so it pings messages to the diaphragm for breathing rate and to the heart for heart rate, so that the upper brain doesn't have to get involved in that process all the time. So information would flood in to the hypothalamus, letting it know what the needs are for oxygen and delivery and carbon dioxide removal in the body. And the hypothalamus would then determine what to set the breathing rate and the heart rate at. It would give that information to the medulla, who would just then send a constant pinging of neural processes down to the heart and lungs to keep it sitting there. And that's why we have a pretty well regulated heart rate and breathing rate at rest. As soon as new information comes in that we're doing something different in the body and we need more oxygen and we need more fuel delivery and we need more breathing, etc., then the hypothalamus would of course become aware of it, and it would tell the medulla oblongata to indirectly adjust the level that the heart's beating at and that the lungs are breathing at. And that of course will reset that to a higher level, which will ensure the supply until the supply needs are met. So pretty important part of the body, medulla oblongata, to keep this guy free to think about all the other things that are going on in the body. It can sort of auto-regulate those things, those key movements of heart rate and breathing. Alright, so you'll see I skipped over a little video there about the brain. I'm not going to go through the videos on this video just for time purposes. You can go back to the original Prezi and access that video and go through it at your own pace anytime. We'll move on to the spinal cord, which is obviously the connector between the peripheral body and the central nervous system. And it's basically composed of a two-way superhighway for information, and the two ways are obviously up and down. Information that is heading up to the brain and information that is heading down to the body parts. It's not quite as clear-cut as this, with all messages going up on one side and all messages going down on the other. What you can notice is that this is one disc of spinal cord, so basically two vertebrae have been pulled apart and you would take a slither out and you can see it has a spinal nerve system attached on each side here, and this is like the on and off ramps for information. So information would travel on through the dorsal root and then up to the brain, and then on the way down when information is coming out to move and do those kinds of come down and jump off the ventral root and head out to the body. So kind of like a superhighway with on and off ramps, traffic coming on and off. Notice the white around the edges here and this grey sort of mass here. The grey indicates the actual nerve tissue that's sending the information, and the white is simply fat that is conducting that information quickly. Okay, so it sort of acts like the the plastic around one of your computer cords or your lamp cord, etc., and stops the electricity from jumping out along the way. Now, good news, we don't need to know any of these massive words that you see here. We just need to know that it's a pathway for communication with messages going up and down. And here we see a closer look at that insert to the spinal cord. So here is the spinal cord, and here's its root ganglion, and we see the dorsal root ganglion with the dorsal root carrying the sensory information that needs to travel into the spinal cord and up to the brain, going on there, and then the motor information coming out the ventral root here and heading back out to body tissues to cause action. So we've looked at the brain, and we've looked at the superhighway for communication, the spinal cord, and now we're going to look at the peripheral nervous system, and that's made up of nerves or neurons. Okay. So these are the communication pathways that connect the rest of the body to the central nervous system. We've got neurons keeping the body informed about what's going on inside and outside of us, and we've also got neurons that carry messages and instructions from the brain and spinal cord out to the body parts to get it to do something that we've decided we want it to do, or that involuntarily we need it to do. There are three types of neuron to be found in the human body, and just before we move on, you may be wondering what the difference is between a nerve and a neuron. Well, what you're probably seeing coming out of the spinal cord here are actually nerves, and these nerves will track to certain places within the body. The higher up, obviously, the body, you can see that that's going to be attaching nerves into the neck and shoulder area, and then we'll probably go down the arm a bit further and into the chest cavity, and the further we go down the spinal cord, we'll get to nerves to the guts, to the lower limbs, and so on, so the whole body's covered there. Now, a nerve would be the equivalent of the cord that your computer is receiving power from. We see it on the outside as one cord, but most of us know that if we were to cut through that cord, we'd find smaller wires inside of different colours that have different roles in the electrical carrying process. And that's true of these. Each of these cords of tissue, known as the nerve that we see coming out of the spinal cord here, would have bundles of neurons, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, all heading in the same direction, but able to branch out at different intervals so that they plug into every square millimetre of your skin, your muscle, your tendons, your blood vessels, and everywhere else. So, you can use the term neuron and nerve interchangeably. When we get into communication between the nervous system and tissues of the body, we'll be talking more about neurons, because it'll be individual neurons that are arriving at individual places. So what are the three types of neuron? You probably have a pretty good sense of this already. Firstly, you've got to let the brain know what's going on, and we do that via sending messages from our sensory receptors, such as our eyes and our skin and our muscle tissue and the things within our body, and we need a link to provide those receptors the ability to send impulses to the brain to let it know what's going on. And that link is a sensory neuron. It travels between the sensory receptors and the spinal cord. They transport the electrical impulses to the spinal cord, and at that point where they enter the spinal cord here, the message is passed to another type of neuron known as an interneuron. The interneurons are found only within the spinal cord and brain, and the thing that sets them apart from the sensory neurons and the other neurons in the body is that they can make decisions. So these guys can assimilate information and effectively come up with responses. And those responses could be voluntary and well thought out. They could be impulsive. They could be reflex, or they could be internal processes that your higher brain's not even aware of that they're going on. 90% of all neurons in the body are interneurons, the vast majority, and most of them are found within the brain. The last of the neuron types are motor neurons, and they carry the information that the brain and spinal cord would like to pass on to body tissues to get an action to occur. So they're exiting out of the spinal cord on the way to the body to cause movement, to cause blood flow changes, to cause changes to organs like heart rate increases or decreases, and breathing. The final point of contact usually can be summarized into muscles, organs, and glands. Those would be three of the main effectors of the human body. So there's a little diagrammatic view of the different neurons and how they're sort of linked up. What you can see in the picture here is a sensory neuron, and you can see it has its little nerve endings here, and they might be attached as an example into your skin. So they're sitting just in your skin surface there, and these particular ones might be there to pick up painful stimuli. So let's say you receive a scratch or something like that, nothing too dramatic that's going to cause a reflex, but you want to look down and have a look at what was going on. Then that would come about, the knowledge of that it was something on you was causing an irritation or scratch would be sent through messages of information coming from the pain receptors and the ends of these neural endings here. They would be conducted right down the length of the sensory neuron, which would be as far as wherever the stimuli was being picked up, and then all the way to the spinal cord. So if it was down on your little toe, it would have to travel some distance up your leg before it plugged into an interneuron, and it would have plugged into the interneuron at the base of the spinal cord. Any other nervous impulses that are sent within this brain and spinal cord will be passed between interneurons. Once a decision has been made, the decision to move or the decision to cause an action or to look at the painful stimuli that's happened would come by sending out messages from the spinal cord out into motor neurons, which would then travel the distance to the appropriate effector to cause the action to occur. And in this case, you can see it's a muscle, and that would cause a muscular contraction, like lifting your hand up that was scratched to have a look at it to see what was going on. So, I guess before we move any further, we've probably established from what I've said so far that the things that are being sent around the system are messages, and those messages take the form of electrical impulses, the same electricity that's travelling through your electrical goods in your house. Sometimes these electrical impulses are known as action potentials, and that's because they have the potential to cause an action. The process, as we've said, starts with the sensory receptor, noticing changes within the body or around the body, and then generating impulses. They will send that off to the brain and spinal cord for analysis before an action may be thought up. The whole process starts with sensory receptors in your skin, muscles, organs, the blood, etc., that are sending these messages in to keep the body informed about what's going on. So this little slide here shows, I guess in a nutshell, how the process works. This is the same 3-box piece of information that's going to be given to you on the test, and you're going to have to come up with a story that clearly shows your understanding of how the sequence of events works. So we're going to do a couple of tasks now just to cement this information. You have these 3 boxes, if I just show you really quickly, in your mock questions. Take you into there, and we'll flip over the page here and go to bottom of page 3 here. You can see receptor, integration, and response. So what I talk about here, feel free to stop the video at any time and write in some answers around these points here. Before we do that, I just thought we better go back and answer the questions we can now answer about the neuron types. So we've got question number 2 here. What are the 3 main components of the nervous system? We've been through them now. The brain, the spinal cord, and nerves or neurons goes into there. We can also answer question 5. What are the 3 types of neuron within the human body? And they are the sensory, the inter, and the motor neurons. Which of the above nerves, from question 5, relay messages about pain, touch, pressure, heat, etc. to the spinal cord? That would be your sensory neurons. And which of these nerves carry messages from the brain out to the organs, the glands, and the muscles? And the answer to that would be motor neurons. Once we've got that filled out, we can return back down to the bottom of page 3 here, where the overriding theme of the nervous system is going to be talked about, and this is where you come up with your examples. And I'll talk about some now, and you're welcome to write these things as you go. So we'll just jump back in to this box as we talk about it. So the first thing I would do here is actually make notes of the key players. The whole thing starts with the receptors, which notice the stimulus. Maybe you'd like to write in next to this box things like pain, pleasure, pressure, touch, hearing, vision. Any of those examples would be examples of receptors in the body that are there to pick up and notice information. The next step we know is we need to get that information to our brain or spinal cord to do something about it. The connection, represented by the arrow here, that sends the information from the receptors into the CNS, this arrow would represent the sensory neuron, and you're welcome to write that in on your notes. Once it enters the integration system, and that would be the central nervous system made up of the spinal cord and brain, the messages are passed to an interneuron. You're welcome to write that in. The interneuron decides what to do after, of course, assimilating the information and deciding what it is that is coming in. Once an appropriate response has been decided on, that information is relayed to the doers or effectors in the body via a motor neuron, and this arrow would represent a motor neuron carrying the messages to the effectors. Examples of effectors would be muscles, glands, or organs. So I'm going to give you an example now of a process or two, and I'm going to use the pictures that I brought up earlier just to give you a visual description of this. So you'd have to excuse my rudimentary drawing on the computer here, but you've got some of these pictures attached to your notes, and you can find them now. And if you just draw in brain and a very rudimentary spinal cord, and this is quite a lot wider than what an actual spinal cord would look like, but I've left room there to draw inside to show the different pathways of communication there. So we're going to do two examples here. I'm just going to label the first one. So as I come in here and just put it here, I'm going to put down here that this first one on this side is going to be a voluntary action. Okay, so this is going to be a voluntary action. Let's make it a bit smaller so it can be read. There we go. So on this side we're going to do a voluntary action. On this side over here we're going to be doing an involuntary action. So we'll show the difference. So the first one, let's say, and again excuse my drawing, that a fly has been pestering you at a barbecue. So this is a fly, of course it is. There's its wings, beautiful. Alright, so a fly keeps landing on your legs, and it's not going to go away, it's going to keep doing this. So you've made the decision after a period of time that you are going to kill this fly next time it comes back. So it's come back. Question is, how do you know it's there? Well, the easy answer to that is that you feel the fly land on your leg, and the reason that you feel it is because messages have been received from sensory receptors in your skin, travelled up a sensory neuron, direction of travel being this way here, and you're welcome to draw these on your diagrams, and we can label that. Just pull a label out here, get another text box for you there, and this is known as a sensory neuron. So the sensory neuron is carrying that information up to the spinal cord. Once it enters the spinal cord, it changes, and I'm going to show that with a change of colour, to the interneuron. And the job of the interneuron at this point is going to be to relay that information up to the brain. Okay, so I'll just put a couple of arrows on here indicating, oh my goodness, excuse my drawing, indicating that the messages are travelling up to the brain, and you can put that in your diagram, and we'll pull this out to here, and we'll add a label, and this label is of course an interneuron. So now that the message has reached the brain has made its decision that the fly needs to die, and it needs to now send out some messages to the muscles that will get that done. So we move into sort of stealth mode to try and get the job done. We'll choose another color here. Let's go maybe a light blue. And this is still, because it's within the spinal cord, these downward messages are still being carried within an interneuron. Okay, it's not until they exit the spinal cord and head out to the muscles of the arm in this case, and this is the arm that's going to be used to reach over and smack the fly, that at this point we're traveling down a motor neuron. So at this point it's probably a good time to just pause and take care of a piece of information that I think a lot of people misunderstand, or certainly don't show clearly that they understand when they're writing about the sequence of events, what you have to do in your mock questions, and we'll go to that space in a moment. So the key is here that these things, these neurons, are just pathways of communication. Think of them like cords. They don't travel anywhere, they don't move anywhere. It's electricity that moves within them. So to say something like the body sends a sensory neuron to the brain, that's not correct. The sensory neuron is simply the connection or the cord that runs between the sensory receptors and the spinal cord. The interneuron is simply a cord or passage that carries information to the brain and within the brain, and then the motor neuron is simply a cord that carries information from the spinal cord out to the body. Alright, so hopefully that clarifies that clearly enough for you. I just labelled this last one motor neuron, and we've got the full set. So, fly landing on the leg, information received, brain decides what to do about it, information sent out or instructions sent out, exiting through motor neurons for the muscles of the arm to work and slap the fly and kill it, hopefully. So that's a voluntary action, and we've got to look at some involuntary actions. And in many cases, an involuntary action, it follows exactly the same process. The only difference is where does it go in the brain. So the voluntary action, of course, has eventually got to the frontal lobe where a conscious decision is made to send out and kill the fly. In the involuntary situation, the conscious brain may never even notice what's going on. It's something that will happen to regulate the body behind the scenes. So the first example we're going to use is heating up. Okay, so let's say we're sitting in the sun, all right, and the sun is beating down on our skin, and of course that's going to raise our temperature. And of course it would raise our core temperature, and information would come from our core temperature. But just to keep it a little bit simpler, what we'll do here is we'll chuck in a sun, just to remind you what we're looking at. This is a sun, quite obviously. And again, if you do this on yours, you don't need to show quite the same prowess as me. So the sun's beating down on the skin. The warmth is recognized by the sensory receptors that are found in your skin, and that information is relayed to the brain firstly from the sensory neuron and read again. So I'll do the same colors that I used over this side. I won't label them this time, but you get the idea. So sensory neuron relays the information into the spinal cord, where it's taken up to the brain via the interneuron. Now this time it's not a conscious decision. You may not even know that you're getting too hot at that point, but your body has certainly recognized that it's getting a little bit too hot and has decided the best thing to do would be to cool off a little. It sends down its interneuron instruction coming back out, and this time we'll keep it quite simple. It'll go to about here before exiting out, and in this case, before we sweat everywhere, we'll go to one of the more common areas for sweating, which is the armpit. And the final result there would be we would start to sweat, okay, and that should help offload some heat, and hopefully that's enough. If not, we'll start to sweat by sending out more and more neurons, motor neurons, to different parts of the body to cause sweating to occur in different places. End result, hopefully, is cooling down. Now, the last example I want to show you here, and I'll just get rid of some of those things there. And this one, let's take it a step further and say, well, what if it needs a reaction? What if it's a dangerous situation here? So in this case, I'm going to take some pink and I'm going to make it burn. So we've burned our hand. Now the pain threshold has definitely been reached here. Nasty looking sort of blister. How do we know we've burned our hand? Same principle as before. Sensory neurons, multiple ones this time, would come in and very, very quickly alert the CNS that a painful stimuli has occurred. Now at this point, you don't even know it's painful stimuli. All you know is that an event has occurred. It's pinged up to the spinal cord where the threshold for pain that is preset in here has been tweaked. And it's pinged and it's reached that threshold and it's decided, no, this needs an immediate response. What will happen now is that the interneuron will simply hook around very quickly, send that pre-programmed response off to the motor neuron, plug into the muscle, and the quickest way would be to bend the elbow and get the hand away from the hot surface. Now that would happen very quickly in the time it takes for the electrical impulse to go bang to the spinal cord and straight out again. A message will be sent up to the brain. So here we see a message being sent up to the brain to inform the brain that a painful stimuli has occurred. It's not until the brain recognizes that it's pain, and that happens in a second or so after, that you actually feel the wave of pain and the full extent of the injury is known. So the burn occurs, the arm is moved to prevent further damage, and then shortly after that the brain registers that pain, and of course you start crying or yelping or doing whatever you do, sticking your mouth and suck on it, that kind of thing. Alright, now it's set up in this fashion so that it happens really quickly, because the longer you spend in contact with the hot surface, the more damage is going to be done. So the body moves it first before the brain is aware of even what happened. And in that sense, we save some milliseconds, and we save hopefully some skin through that process there. So I hope that's relatively clear. I hope you've got a bit of a sense of what's going on with the nervous system there. And of course, if we just delve back into here, to show your understanding, you want to write a wee story here, okay? And that little story could be one of the ones I've just shown you there. It starts, of course, with the receptors, picking up information, sending it up the sensory neuron, passing it to the interneuron, which decides what to do, information back through the motor neuron to the effectors, and some action occurs. You can use a sporting example, a burn example, whatever else, as long as it's accurate. Put one down here that you can study up and remember to reproduce in the exam. So we're getting pretty close to the end of this first part of the nervous system lecture. We'll just dive back in one last time. What I would like to do to finish off, and of course there are some videos and bits and pieces on the full Prezi that you can check out that show a video process of what we've just talked about. But I want to leave you with this image here. This image is a generalized version of a neuron. So let's say this is a interneuron. The interneuron here has its head with its nucleus here, with the DNA, the information about how to make one of these neurons is kept. It has these sprouts coming out of its head here called dendrites, and these are where the sensory receptors would sit here. So these might plug into the skin if it was a sensory neuron, but in the case of an interneuron, these here would be reaching out ready to meet with the end, like over here, of a sensory neuron, so that the information can be passed on down the interneuron and off to the next point of the process, if you like. So the only thing I want to leave you with on this one here, it's the final thing we'll do in this little lesson, is you need to be familiar with this picture. It's going to be in the exam. The 7 key words or parts need to be known and identified. In the test, 4 will be missing and 3 will be present. You need to know the ones that are missing and fill them in. So we have our dendrites here. We have our nucleus. The entire head here is known as the cell body or soma. We're not going to worry about the axon hillock. It has no function. It's just the neck here. But the axon, this is actually pointing to the purple strip underneath, which runs the entire length of the neuron. And remember, that could be as long as from your toes up to your spinal cord. So it could be over a meter in length, depending on where the neuron is and what it's connecting. Now, the neuron axon here is covered in junctions here by these yellow blobs, which are yellow fat blobs known as myelin sheath. And those myelin sheath are produced by a little cell called the Schwann cell, which is this little orange circle you see here. The final part we need to be aware of is the synaptic knob, or the end point, which is then going to plug into the next point of the chain, whether that be another neuron or whether it be an effector like a muscle gland or organ. Now, it's not important at this point that you know what any of these things do. I just want you to be familiar with the picture. I want you to know the different parts. So the last thing we'll do in this lesson here is go back into our mock questions. We'll go up to page number 2. The bottom of page number 2 has draw a diagram showing a generalized version of the neuron. So you can draw in or trace a picture of that neuron, label those key ones. Like I said, you can get in there and maybe scrub out the axon hillock, leaving 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 parts. 4 will be missing on the day. You'll need to recognize which ones are missing and write in the missing parts. So finish that one up. That's a good start to the nervous system. We've chunked it up into sort of about the time a lecture in class would take, and there'll be another lecture following this one. So keep those mock questions handy. Obviously there's a few more to fill out as we go through, and just a reminder that this document here on screen becomes your study tool going forward into the exam. Thanks for your attention and listening. Catch you soon.